Hi, everyone. Thanks for logging in today. I'm Jennifer Atkinson. I'm a professor of environmental studies at the University of Washington, where I've taught for the past 11 years. And I'm joining you today from Seattle, which I want to acknowledge is on the occupied land of the Duwamish people. I was invited today to talk about the topic of climate anxiety and eco-grief, that sense of doom and despair that has really been growing around the world as we hear all these grim projections about the suffering that we're headed for if we don't act very fast. But also as more and more people experience climate disruption and disasters in their own lives and wake up to the alarming fact that climate change is already here. So I'll talk for about 40 minutes and then leave some time at the end to hear from all of you as we shift to an open discussion. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, oops. So what kind of emotional and psychological toll are we experiencing from this crisis? I want to answer that to begin with by sharing a snapshot of how I first got involved in this topic. And I thought I'd do that by reading a short excerpt from my podcast that introduces this personal story. And I know that sometimes people have to log out early. So if this topic interests you, but you can't stick around for the entire session, the podcast is all about climate grief and the ways that we can harness those dark feelings to generate solutions. So that's a resource if you want to explore this more after my talk. And while I'm reading this opening excerpt, I'm also going to share some slides that tell that very familiar story of ecological assault, while also highlighting some of the ways that I have inadvertently traumatized my own students in the process of teaching about climate change. Because I think this is a good reminder of how we often end up in a place of despair. So here's my podcast excerpt. A student of mine once commented that if universities could monitor the collective pulse rate in environmental courses, they'd station medics in our classrooms. Given the way I facilitated courses during my first 10 years as an educator, such a measure may have been prudent. Like so many of my colleagues, I taught about climate issues by feverishly pulling items from the bottomless grab bag of ecological horrors and tossing them indiscriminately into students' laps like emotional grenades. Mass extinction and dying oceans, community displacement and melting ice caps, planetary arsonists elected to high office, the suffering of frontline communities, starving wildlife, burning forests, rising seas, and a diminished world for all who will come after us. However, it was rare in those early years of teaching for me to pause and ask students how this material made them feel. In fact, I did my best to avoid that question because when we did wander into that murky emotional terrain, someone would inevitably end up in tears or find themselves unable to speak or start trembling with rage or grief. I took it for granted that such moments detracted from the discussion and steered around those quote unquote digressions as breakdowns so that we could quickly get back to the real content. I'll admit, however, that I was also seeking to protect myself. I felt emotionally and spiritually depleted by the outrage and heartbreak that can become a daily poison drip for those aware of society's relentless environmental and social justice assaults. How could I manage to keep teaching climate issues across the decades when I myself felt so overwhelmed by grief? So this is partly what led me to research the emotional impacts of our climate crisis, especially as I was seeing more and more of my own students falling into hopelessness. And that was really more concerning to me than my own personal grief because it raised the prospect of what could happen if the next generation of climate leaders burns out or retreats into apathy. And it also made me wonder why our approach to climate change has almost exclusively focused on the physical impacts of this crisis, the external damage, and yet we rarely talk about the landscape of damage we're all carrying around inside of us, those invisible traumas that we internalize from either witnessing or experiencing firsthand so much destruction of life. One of the reasons for that silence is there's no shared cultural practice in our society for mourning the loss of non-human lives. And that makes it hard to fully process their personal impact, or to even recognize that that pain exists, because for such a long time, many of us didn't have a language to talk about this. And this has changed in recent years with the rising popularity of terms like eco-anxiety, eco-grief, climate anxiety, climate despair. And it's not just climate activists who've adopted this language. The American Psychological Association put out a major report in 2017 documenting this mental health crisis. They define eco-anxiety as the chronic fear of environmental doom. Symptoms can range from sleep disorders and substance abuse to chronic depression and anxiety. Climate psychology has become a new field in recent years, with therapists seeing more patients with anxiety and depression about our future. Then earlier this year, reports were coming out of Australia of a mental health crisis in the wake of the bushfires. And by the way, just a decade earlier, Australia had already suffered through the longest drought ever recorded on the continent, which devastated farmers' crops and livelihoods. And studies of that disaster showed a spike in depression, alcoholism, domestic violence, and suicide among those farmers. The term eco-anxiety was even on the short list for Oxford's Word of the Year in 2019. They ultimately chose climate emergency. And I would even argue that one of the reasons Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg has become a figurehead of the global climate strikes and captured the attention of people around the world is because she's been so frank in talking about the depression she suffered in facing this existential threat. That story really struck a nerve with many people who'd never heard a public figure openly acknowledge this before. Then this here is from researcher Stephen Running, who's mapped our responses to environmental loss onto the classic 5 stages of grief. This particular model is really common. It's based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and you find different versions of it everywhere. Some psychologists have critiqued this because even if our responses don't unfold in this tidy linear fashion, I'm sorry, even if our responses don't unfold in this tidy linear fashion, I still feel that everybody here has experienced some of these stages at some point, whether it's denial or anger or depression. So what I want to do today is give examples of 4 different groups experiencing climate grief, and then discuss how we might draw insights from all of them to channel this distress into meaningful transformation and solutions. Okay, so the first group are students and young people. This is the group I know best because over the past 11 years of teaching, I've watched them fall farther and farther into despair. These here are some quotes from the first day of one of my own classes. And students tell me about having nightmares of water wars and climate refugees and mass extinction. Some have said they are not going to have kids because they're afraid of sentencing them to live through a climate apocalypse. Many are very angry at older generations that are handing them this mess. This particular meme was posted by Jamie Margolin, an 18-year-old Colombian American climate justice activist. And it captures the frustration of her generation being told by leaders how inspiring they are and that they're going to grow up and change the world when those adults are in power right now, and yet they're not taking that responsibility. The coronavirus pandemic is now exacerbating that intergenerational resentment. And again, Margolin has commented on how youth are being asked to make sacrifices and forego all these rites of passage like prom and graduation to protect predominantly older people. And yet that older generation has not reciprocated when it comes to climate threats. So this quote here, she writes, "My generation is giving up our youth, our schooling, our fun, and our freedom so that you can see next year. When this is over, you may have to keep giving something up so that we can see next century. And it's not just Gen Z, but it's also millennials like Mary Heglar, another really prominent activist who's written about the ways that her generation's climate despair is now overlapping with and magnified by the coronavirus. Then the second group I'd highlight are scientists. Environmental scientists suffer some of the highest rates of eco-depression. They're the ones running the terrifying projections and documenting the disappearance of our natural world up close. And I think it's really important to remember that most natural scientists go into their line of work precisely because they are passionate about forests or coral reefs or whatever species of wildlife they study. So it's not surprising at all that they experience trauma from watching the death and disappearance of their life's work. Catherine Wilkinson is one of the senior writers of the book Drawdown, and she once said, there is no way for me not to have a broken heart on most days. But then scientists are also in a unique position that makes it harder to cope with those emotional aspects because their field puts so much emphasis on objectivity and detachment. So there's a stigma around discussing subjective or emotional responses. And that means that many scientists are concerned about compromising their professional credibility by appearing too emotional. Then the third group suffering this existential crisis are communities on the front lines of climate disruption who are experiencing direct impacts and harm. And as always, it is the poor and overwhelmingly Black, Indigenous, and communities of color that are suffering the heaviest impacts and the worst emotional toll from climate assaults. Hurricane Katrina is a classic example simply because it's been so extensively researched. APA reports showed that 1 in 6 people impacted met the diagnosis for PTSD, and suicide or suicidal thoughts more than doubled for displaced people in New Orleans, which makes sense since those Black and low-income neighborhoods already had inadequate access to affordable housing and healthcare and emergency services, not to mention mental health services, which just makes it that much harder to recover from climate disasters. So I want to pause for a moment just to remind everybody that we need to be careful to not use the term natural disaster for these kinds of events, since that language suggests that the harm or loss of life is a pure act of nature. And there's no way to prevent it then, and no one's responsible. The thing to remember is that the wildfire flames or the wind and water from a hurricane do involve natural elements, but that's not where the disaster lies. A disaster is what happens when those elements collide with social and political structures that have left certain people vulnerable and that fail to support them in preparation or in the aftermath, while communities with privilege have resources to insulate themselves or evacuate or withstand the impact. So there's nothing natural about those disparities. How wealthy and frankly, how white you are is the biggest predictor of who survives and recovers from an extreme weather event. Then for many Indigenous people, a warming climate is wiping out traditional hunting and cultural practices, especially in the Arctic, where it's preventing people from traveling to ancestral sites because the landscape is melting beneath them. Suicide has risen significantly in those communities. People say that their cultural identity is being devastated. This particular quote on the slide from an Inuit woman captures that cultural and spiritual erasure. She writes, Inuit are people of the sea ice. If there is no more ice, how can we be people of the sea ice? And this is, of course, just the latest chapter in a long history of colonialism and racism. And for that reason, climate injustice is magnifying past traumas. So these are exactly the kinds of connections we see over and over when we recognize the intersections between the climate crisis and the broader crisis of inequality in our country. Especially in this moment of pandemic, which has put a magnifying glass on everything that was already unjust and dysfunctional about white supremacy and capitalism. In addition to the extreme weather events I mentioned, communities of color have long been suffering from the slow violence of incremental environmental harm. They're more likely to live downwind from smokestacks and downstream from hazardous waste flows, or live next to coal-fired plants and hazardous waste sites. In fact, nearly 1 in 5 Black people live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, where asthma rates are astronomical. And then along comes the pandemic, where the death rate for Black people is 2.3 times higher than for white Americans. And studies have shown that one important factor behind this is that even a moderate increase in community air pollution, mostly from fossil fuel burning, can lead to significant increases in COVID-19 death rates. And Black and Latino communities have already spent a lifetime absorbing a bigger dose of that pollution. So 2020 has just been a critical flashpoint amplifying the intersections of our climate crisis, the racial disparities of the COVID pandemic, and of course, state violence against Black people. These 3 forms of structural violence that are expressed very vividly in that image of suffocation and the words, "I can't breathe." These are the last words that George Floyd spoke as he was suffocated by the police. They express the experience of Black and brown people whose lungs shut down from COVID-19 and their everyday experience of not being able to breathe or thrive in their polluted communities under the violence of climate change. So grief within the Black community particularly becomes another manifestation of that suffocating experience of structural oppression. Water. Okay, then the final group that's suffering from climate anxiety is actually everybody. Conservative, progressive, climate deniers, and hardcore activists, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, everybody's daily life is changing in 1,000 subtle ways. And this can go undetected from the narrow perspective of the immediate present. But as soon as you get people to start talking about the past and how things are different from when they grew up, they will tell stories of slow-moving changes like the loss of bees and songbirds, the disappearance of trees they used to see while driving to work, or those annual fishing trips where they come back with less and less every year. Nights outside where you can't see the stars because of wildfire smoke. All of that adds up to a deep and very personal sense of loss. And this is what philosopher Glenn Albrecht calls solastalgia. He's playing on the concept of of nostalgia, right? A longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to. But solastalgia happens while you're still at home. So it's the pain of watching your familiar surroundings become unfamiliar. And he defines the condition technically as a homesickness experienced without ever leaving home. I think that all of the recent smoke from these climate fires in our region is a prime example of this. So solastalgia is not just an affliction of well-to-do environmentalists. In parts of coal country, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, scientific studies have shown that rates of clinical depression are significantly higher in areas with mountaintop removal than in other coal mining regions or coal mining areas in that same region. And the quote on this slide is from a Virginia resident commenting on her depression after the surrounding landscape was demolished by mountaintop removal. So all of this is just a snapshot of some different ways that eco-anxiety and grief are experienced. I want to shift a little bit now and say a few words about how we typically think about grief and how we might reframe the experience of climate grief in more empowering ways. I've been facing that question or exploring that question in my podcast. In a nutshell, Facing It looks at how grief might actually be a valuable resource for us in the fight for climate justice. So I'm going to read one more 2-minute excerpt from an episode that picks up where I left off in reading that story from the beginning of this talk. When I first launched my seminar on eco-anxiety, I was every bit as distressed as my students and looking for ways to extinguish my grief for all this suffering. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like succumbing to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. But in time, it dawned on me that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed because it's not dysfunctional. It's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. In fact, grief can be a tremendous source of wisdom as we move into an uncertain climate future. I know this may sound controversial in a moment when environmentalists are urging us to focus on hope, but the two are not mutually exclusive. And for many people, grief may be an even more powerful force for transformation. First, grief isn't just one of many options for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing the emotional toll of all this lost beauty in life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. In all those cases, we're not just losing something we once had, we're also losing the future that many of us had counted on. We can't act creatively and honestly in this new reality if we still believe we're living in the old one. And most of us are stuck in a pre-climate change fantasy realm, clinging to delusions that our world in coming years will still be the world we imagined growing up. Denial isn't just a description for people who reject the science. It describes university professors like me and scientists studying climate change and activists fighting to keep things from getting worse. We understand the problem intellectually, but we don't live as though we do. We accept the facts, but we haven't felt our way through what those facts mean, how our lives, how all lives will be undone in some way. We're like the person who knows a loved one is gone, but hasn't let that reality penetrate to their core, where it will reorganize all the ways they relate to the past and future and determine all they'll have to let go of. So that excerpt is from the second episode. But then as the podcast progresses, I'm also trying to push beyond just reframing grief as something that's not bad, to also consider ways that it's actively good. So I want to be clear here, if it wasn't already obvious by now, that if you logged into this talk hoping that I would share some insight that would make your grief go away, you may be disappointed, because that's not what I'm going to do. First, I don't have the power to do that without deluding you. But second, even if we could, my argument is that we probably wouldn't want to, because grief can be deeply transformative and beneficial towards mobilizing meaningful social change and solidarity. And there are 3 reasons I would make that claim. The first is that grief arises from deep attachment and connection. It is a sign of love for our world. I always remind my students, you will not grieve for something you don't love. So even though it's often unconscious, grief is a way of honoring and affirming our connection and our empathy with other species or other people. It's a response that arises out of the recognition that our existence and our well-being are fundamentally entwined with other lives. And that's an insight that is so disastrously missing from our entire modern worldview and way of life under consumer capitalism. So the act of remembering how intimately our lives are bound up with others is going to be key to our collective survival and liberation. So the takeaway here is we shouldn't think of grief and love as opposites, but actually two sides of the same coin. And Seattle artist Chris Jordan has written that when we try to be cheerful and suppress our grief for the world, we're also suppressing our love for it. And I want to expand on this point for a moment because I think it offers some really important insights for the ongoing debate in climate circles over how we motivate people to act. This is like the everlasting question. What is the most effective affect in getting people to respond? Is it fear or hope or anger or guilt? If you look at environmental communication in recent years, there's been overwhelming focus on hope as the key to political action. But a lot of thoughtful scholars point out that hope can be a way of deferring action onto the future or onto other people. And hope can let us off the hook by luring us into a false sense of comfort that everything will turn out in the end. And I want to be clear that this debate about hope is incredibly complex and more nuanced than I have time to explore today. I have multiple podcast episodes exploring different versions of this: active hope, critical hope, intrinsic hope. What I'm referring to here is that easy version of hope that can quickly become, I hope someone else fixes this. And that's what Derek Jensen is criticizing in the quote on this slide. I'm certainly not saying that pessimism is a winning strategy, but we've got to remember that hope is not the end game. We have to be disciplined in asking ourselves what we really want. And for me, getting people to take collective action is infinitely more important than getting them to feel hopeful. So on this slide, Emily Johnson warns us about getting tangled up in psychological distractions that are just about feeling good, rather than committing ourselves to acting on behalf of justice and our obligations to each other. So she says here that even in a hopeless state, quote, we still have the chance to make the space for hope, to act in such a way that hope might exist for others who come after us. So this is where I come back to grief. Grief is by definition a function of love, while hope is not. You can feel hope without love, right? I hope there's a parking space open. I hope my team wins, whatever. You cannot feel grief without love. That's what grief is. And I think that love is far more powerful in motivating us to fight than any other affect. There is no limit to the lengths that we will go to protect who and what we love, even when we don't think we have hope. When someone you love is terminally ill, you don't stop acting on their behalf just because their situation seems hopeless. You do whatever you can, the odds be damned. Then the second positive aspect of eco-grief is it breaks down boundaries that we've created between ourselves and other species, as well as other humans. We live in a culture where some lives matter and others don't. Some deaths receive elaborate tributes and mourning rituals, while others are trivialized or ignored. And of course, groups like Black Lives Matter, people seeking justice for murdered Indigenous women, and trans and homeless and LGBTQ activists know firsthand how this absence of public grief dehumanizes them, which is why they deliberately use public protests and vigils to ensure that those deaths aren't pushed into the shadows. That refusal to protect ourselves from the pain of witnessing other species' death is an act that some scholars identify as resistant mourning, which consciously chooses to hold on to feelings of pain and grief to spur a sense of responsibility for the loss. And that connects to the third point that many Indigenous scholars have made about grief as a way of confronting the legacy of climate colonialism. Ron Reed is from the Karuk tribe in California, And he's written that when his tribe, like so many other indigenous people in North America, talk about community, they're also including plants and animals and the land, which they consider to be sacred relatives. So that inevitably leads to grief when they're destroyed. But, and this is a quote from his essay, he writes, because the dominant non-native society does not recognize the deep emotional tolls we describe between humans and the natural world, kark, grief, and other emotions related to their loss is invisible. And that invisibility and lack of legitimacy compounds the harm done to Indigenous people. This is what's referred to as disenfranchised grief, a loss that's experienced but can't be openly acknowledged or publicly mourned. Okay, so from here, I want to turn to some strategies for navigating climate grief and anxiety. And I bet many of you have your own, and we're going to have time at the end for you to share those. But please keep in mind those 3 insights that I just shared, that the goal is not to extinguish grief, but rather to channel it towards meaningful social transformation. All right, so number 1 is acknowledge it. Basically, everything I just covered is a form of acknowledging our distress. If you're like me and you lie awake at night imagining the end of the world, just hearing yourself say that out loud makes it more manageable. Many of you probably know the saying in neuroscience, if you can name it, you can tame it. And one of the reasons this openness is especially important when it comes to anxiety and grief around climate issues is precisely because both the cause and the emotional impact remain so unacknowledged in public life. When we barely have a vocabulary to even name this condition, of course it's going to seem irrational or deviant. You also hear a lot of climate activists say they feel intense pressure to always project hope and optimism. And of course, hope-based communication is strategically important. We all understand that. But the climate community can go too far in policing expressions of darker emotions. And that can end up backfiring when you consider that suppressing feelings of sadness and anger leads to much bigger problems down the road. That's where, you know, you get into chronic depression, substance abuse, rage. There's extensive research showing how these result from repressing our emotions. Then number 2, talk about it. I already mentioned that hearing yourself talk out loud about dark feelings is itself therapeutic, but the benefits are social as well. One of the perennial questions in climate work is, why aren't more people taking action and demanding change? And our typical assumption is that the public doesn't care or doesn't understand the science. But the research shows that this is not true. In national polling, almost 90% of Americans believe climate change is happening, and 62% identify as being either concerned or very worried, according to the most recent surveys from the Yale Program on Climate Communication. But even though we're carrying this fear and concern around, you know, in our hearts, we live in a culture of climate silence, at least in the US. People don't talk about it, and that makes it seem less urgent or less likely that we'll see ourselves as the ones with agency and responsibility. Instead, we assume that scientists or politicians are going to deal with it. And this is extremely problematic for the simple reason that we are social creatures. Evidence-based psychology shows that having conversations and social interactions is the driving force for behavior change. Whether you're interacting at the workplace or schools or sports events or on social media, you know, we look around and we take our cues from each other. And when climate change never comes up, it reinforces a socially constructed denial. George Marshall's book, which I have on this slide here, Don't Even Think About It, is really brilliant on this subject. I highly recommend it. But on another level, and this directly connects back to the theme of this entire conference today, a huge part of the depression and anxiety in response to environmental issues or any crisis comes from feeling alone and isolated. When you feel isolated, you are not empowered to take action. So talking about emotional responses can help create a sense of community and solidarity. And when I surveyed my students at the end of the quarter, they said over and over that the single most helpful thing about taking my seminar was being in the room with other people talking about the same struggles and being heard when they voiced distress. So the takeaway here is when it comes to the climate emergency, we have to get rid of this binary thinking about talk versus action, or that we need less talk and more action. This is really misleading. Talk is action. Okay, and then number 3, oops, let's get these slides working. Get outside or make time for other forms of self-care. I'm sure that everybody has seen one of these headlines at some point about the research showing that time spent outdoors enhances mental health and well-being. People who've remained successful in environmental activism over the long term draw strength from their connections to nature. But most activists are notoriously bad at giving themselves breaks. We feel like we have to attend every meeting or volunteer event or protest, and then we feel guilty when we don't. But self-care is exactly the kind of work that enables us to be social change agents and helps us avoid burnout so that we can stay engaged over the long haul. The climate battle is a marathon, it's not a sprint. So I love Maya Angelou's reminder here where she writes, "Every person deserves a day away in which no problems are confronted, no solutions searched for. On that day, we need to withdraw from the cares which will not withdraw from us." But just as importantly, being in nature reminds us why it's worth fighting for climate solutions in the first place. The world is still a beautiful place, and there's still so much left to protect. Rachel Carson once said, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." And then lastly, number 4, take action. Action is the best antidote to grief. There is nothing more therapeutic. It's action that gives rise to hope. It's not the other way around. And I don't say this in the naive sense of believing that me planting trees or going to a climate march is going to solve the problem. The real power here is that getting engaged helps us build solidarity. And once again, one of the main reasons people feel hopeless and depressed in the face of this threat is they think they're alone in that concern. And we are not likely to get involved or to take action when we feel isolated. So cognitive psychologists emphasize how important it is to imagine ourselves as part of a team. And that also counteracts the really pervasive concern that our actions are too insignificant to matter, right? Why even bother? My own students hit this wall all the time. They feel helpless because their impact is dwarfed by the scale of the crisis. But if we see ourselves as working collectively rather than individually, we can recognize that all contributions sync up with a larger network of change. This is what Adrienne Marie Brown calls Emergent Strategy. It's a movement that spirals out from all kinds of small local actions and connections to create complex systems. Economist Donatella Meadows makes a similar point when she reminds us to think about leverage points, where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. And there's an example I love from Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark. In the 1960s, the Women's Strike for Peace was one of the first organized anti-nuclear movements in the US. And when they were interviewed, participants said they felt that their efforts achieved nothing at the time. But in fact, they ultimately contributed to major victories like the ban on above ground nuclear testing, which was creating radioactive fallout showing up in mother's milk and baby's teeth. And this slide here shows an excerpt from an interview with one of those activists. Solnit wrote, "The woman from WSP told of how foolish and futile she had felt standing in the rain one morning protesting at the Kennedy White House. Years later, she heard Dr. Benjamin Spock, who had become one of the most high-profile activists on the issue, say that the turning point for him was spotting a small group of women standing in the rain protesting at the White House. If they were so passionately committed, he thought, he should give the issue more consideration himself. So this is a reminder that social change is hard to measure. So the next time you hear Greta Thunberg or whatever prominent climate figure give some big speech before the UN, remember that they are just a single visible point resulting from the invisible work of thousands of unnamed people behind the scenes. Scientists, activists, journalists who brought their attention to the climate story in the first place, the teachers who ignited their awareness, some anonymous passerby who said an encouraging word to keep them going during, their strikes. And then, of course, all of the youth climate strikers and activists who are spreading and amplifying this message and having impacts of their own, which are impossible to trace and may not be visible until years down the road. But that should be reason for hope rather than discouragement. Because every time we have a conversation or share a book or inspire someone through our work, those actions may be multiplied by a larger community that we'll never even meet. So I want to close with this quote from Margaret Mead. It's a line that I've always loved. She wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." I've also included my social media information on this slide, where I try to post new talks and workshops on those platforms or information on new podcast episodes. So please follow me if you want updates on any of those. We're going to move now to an open discussion because I think everyone here has some insight on this topic. And now that I've been talking all this time and I've shared my insights, I think we can really all benefit from hearing from each other. So we can think of this as a chance to crowdsource some techniques that you might use for coping when burnout and hopelessness arise. So I have these two questions posted that might frame your comments or your contributions to the group. Number one, what is your primary dark emotion in response to climate change? How does that emotion impact your work, or how do you see it? What kind of symptoms can you identify? And then second, what strategies help you cope?